The world always rewards what it deems worthy. And if you've ever felt like you were standing outside that charmed circle, watching others receive the praise, the attention, the easy path, then you know exactly where our story begins. Meet Elara. Her sister Lila was the embodiment of worthiness in their family's eyes. Lila possessed the sharp, quick grace the family valued. She was the delicate painting meant for display. Elara, however, was the canvas rejected. She carried a kindness in her soul and, to her father's endless shame, a body that refused to conform to his rigid standards. Elara was a reminder of failure, a silent protest against their perfect lineage. The rancher, Magnus Holt, was a different kind of man, carved from the unforgiving plains he owned. He was a force, a legend, and critically, a potential alliance the family desperately needed. A deal was struck. A bride was promised. And that bride, everyone knew, was meant to be Lila, the beautiful, compliant trophy daughter. A fair exchange for a fortress like the Holt Ranch. But Elara's father was not merely transactional. He was cruel. He didn't just want to forge an alliance, he wanted to settle a score, to deliver a final, perfect insult. He saw a chance to punish not one, but two people simultaneously. Elara for simply existing, and Magnus for the arrogance of his expectations. So when the wagon was ready and Lila stood waiting, dressed in her wedding silks, their father's mouth curled into a smile, colder than any winter wind. He didn't lift a hand. He simply lifted his voice. Lila? No, take her. He shoved Elara forward, the rough homespun of her traveling dress a stark contrast to Lila's silk. The air twisted tight. Lila gasped, caught between shock and a strange, sudden relief. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She wasn't just being discarded. She was being weaponized. She was the joke meant to wound. The journey was a silent, grinding agony. Every mile the wagon wheels turned was a mile deeper into the realization that she was a parcel of unwanted stock, destined to be returned. She had lived a life where she felt invisible. Now she was actively being sent to be seen and rejected. That difference, that cruel twist of intent, was a fresh wound. When the wagon finally stopped, the silence that fell was heavy enough to crush bone. And there he was, Magnus Holt. He was the definition of the word formidable. Tall, broad-dressed in worn leather that spoke of real, back-breaking work, not parlor-room pretense. His face, weathered and stern, spoke of solitude and command. He walked forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, his gaze scanning the wagon with an owner's certainty. And then, his eyes landed on Elara. That was the moment the world stopped. The confusion was brief, quickly replaced by a furious tightening around his jaw. It wasn't just anger. It was the cold, calculated fury of a powerful man who realizes he has been played. This is not the one promised. Magnus's voice cut through the air, sharp and final, every word a stone hurled at her. The men surrounding him shifted, embarrassed. Elara could feel their silent judgment, the confirmation of what she already knew. She was not enough. She stood there small and pathetic, refusing to lower her eyes only because she was afraid if she looked down, she would never be able to lift her head again. She saw the rage in him, the immediate, instinctive urge to toss her back onto the wagon. But then the wind carried a sound, the distant, retreating rattle of her father's wagon, already a cloud of dust on the horizon. The symbolic door had slammed shut. There was no going back. Magnus took a breath, long and deep, his chest expanding with reluctant acceptance. His eyes, the color of storm-swept ice, raked over her one last time. The words that followed were a cold knife, Fine, he muttered, the single word dripping with contempt. You'll do for now. For now. It was not a welcome. It was a verdict, a stay of execution. He didn't offer a hand or a kind word. He simply turned his massive back on her, walking toward the looming darkness of the ranch house. Come along. Don't fall behind, he ordered, the command tossed over his shoulder like a scrap. It was the first harsh instruction of a life she had not chosen, pulling her deeper into a destiny shaped by her father's malice and the cold pride of the rancher, who considered her a burden. And with every heavy, reluctant step she took toward that house, she whispered the promise to herself. They sent the wrong sister. They sent the one they thought would break, but I will not give them that satisfaction. The real battle, she realized, had just begun. The ranch house was not a home. It was a cold, imposing structure of heavy wood and silent accusation. Every step Elara took across the stone threshold felt less like an entry and more like an incarceration. Magnus didn't look back, didn't offer a light or a word, only moving with the heavy, certain gait of a man who suddenly found himself burdened by an immovable object. The air was thick with the dust of the plains and the tension of his unspent rage. She watched him pour a drink, the action methodical and unforgiving, and the simple act of his ignoring her was louder than any shout. This was her new reality, not welcomed, not hated, but simply dismissed as an unfortunate accessory to a broken contract. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Finally, Magnus set down his glass, the clink of glass on wood echoing in the vast, quiet room, a sound that demanded attention. He still did not turn to face her fully, speaking instead to the far wall, his voice low and dangerous. Your father's insolence is a debt, not yours, but mine. He sought to shame me, to make me a laughingstock among the men who respect my word. He paused, his shoulder flexing under the worn leather. I made a promise, and a Holt does not break his word, not even for a serpent's trick. You may be the wrong daughter, but you are the blood of the contract, and my word is law. He spun then, his gaze finally slamming into hers, raw and unforgiving. Do not mistake my adherence to honor for kindness, woman. You are a mistake. You are a debt. You are a burden. The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Since I cannot send you back, you will earn your keep. You will not sit idle in my house. He listed the tasks, but they were not the expected chores of a wife. They were the labor of the utterly unwanted, mucking the stalls of the most troublesome cattle, scrubbing the kitchen floors with lye until her hands bled, hauling the heaviest water buckets from the well before dawn, a time when even the ranch hands slept. The work is meant to break you, he stated flatly, his lips barely moving. I don't expect you to last a week, but you will try. Every sunrise, you will try until you either quit or the cold sends you running home. The intention was clear. This was her punishment. A cruel extension of her father's joke, designed to push her to her physical and emotional limit. He didn't want her gone just to satisfy his ego. He wanted her to beg to leave, to admit her own failure. That night, lying on a narrow, hard bed, in a room that smelled of dust and indifference, Elara felt the full weight of her situation. Her throat was tight with unshed tears, her stomach twisted with hunger and fear. The humiliation was a physical ache, a searing heat across her skin. They sent me to be broken. The thought echoed in the desolate quiet of the ranch. But then an odd thing happened. The very cruelty of the plan, the naked desire to see her fail, became a terrible, twisted form of fuel. She thought of Lila, free and adored. She thought of her father, laughing at the successful execution of his malice. And in that dark room, something shifted from despair to a quiet, cold, and terrible resolve. They want me to break. They expect me to run. A tremor ran through her, but it was not fear. It was the first faint spark of defiance. I will not give them the satisfaction. It was a vow whispered not to the stars outside the tiny window, but to the small, wounded part of her soul that had endured a lifetime of dismissal. The work could wear her down. The silence could isolate her, and Magnus's disdain could cut her, but she would endure. The first morning she was out before the sun, her body soft and clumsy against the demanding world of the ranch. The mud was thick, the bucket handles rough, and the weight was agonizing. She stumbled, fell, and swallowed the metallic taste of dust and shame. When she glanced up, Magnus was there, not helping, not speaking, just watching from the porch with his arms crossed, an immovable statue of expectation. He was the warden of her prison, and his presence was a constant, chilling reminder of his verdict. He wanted to see her failure confirmed. He wanted her to prove her father right, but with every strained muscle and every stinging scratch, her internal vow deepened. She was a burden, yes, a mistake, perhaps, but she would be the most difficult burden he had ever carried, the one that stubbornly refused to disappear. And as the sun finally crested the horizon, casting the ranch in brutal, honest light, Elara clutched the rough wooden handle of the bucket, her resolve hardening from a whisper to a stone-cold certainty. This is where the transformation truly begins, not in grand gestures, but in the relentless repetition of hard labor. This is the truth about earning your place. It requires scars, both visible and invisible. For Elara, the days blurred into a cycle of ache, dust, and silence. The work assigned to her wasn't just physical. It was designed to be psychologically draining. Mucking stalls for the most ornery animals meant confronting things that smelled foul and fought back. Scrubbing floors on her knees was a constant, humbling reminder of her diminished status. And those heavy water buckets, hauled before the sun had cleared the horizon, were a daily test of pure will. She wasn't just battling the land. She was battling her own body, which had been accustomed to comfort, not this brutal efficiency. The truth is, when you are pushed past what you thought your limits were, you find a second reservoir of strength you didn't know you possessed. Initially, her arms would scream in protest within minutes. Her back felt like it was splitting with every lift. She stumbled often, catching herself only by sheer stubborn refusal to fall completely. But she forced herself to adopt a rhythm. 1 step, 2 steps, lift, dump. The movements were clumsy at first, but with each passing day they became marginally less so. Her hands, once soft, were now a roadmap of blisters and calluses. Her skirts, no longer merely wrinkled, were torn and perpetually stained with mud and toil. Magnus Holt was the ghost of her labor. He was never close enough to offer help, but always close enough to witness failure. He was the silent observer, and his presence was more taxing than the work itself. He wouldn't offer a nod or a single word of praise. He simply watched, his arms often crossed, his expression unreadable, waiting for the crack. He expected tears, a complaint, a tantrum, anything that would confirm her father's low estimation of her character. But Elara had a secret weapon, the cold, quiet fire of defiance. She knew that every groan, every complaint would be a victory for the people who wanted her gone. So she endured. She would return to her bare room at night, her body a symphony of aches, but something inside her whispered, "Endure, just endure." The tears still came, silently into her pillow, but by morning they were dried, replaced by the grim determination to face the shovel again. What she didn't realize was that her endurance was slowly chipping away at Magnus's certainty. He was a man who understood labor, a man who respected the land and those who met its challenge head on. He had seen strong men quit the ranch in days. He had expected the pampered daughter to collapse in hours. Yet every morning, there she was, not graceful, not skilled, but present. He started noticing small details. The way she tied a piece of leather around the handle of her bucket to protect her raw palms. The stubbornness in her jaw when she strained to lift something too heavy. He never spoke these observations aloud, but his eyes would linger longer than they should have, cataloging her refusal to be useless. He was not seeing the obese daughter sent as a joke. He was seeing the quiet persistence of a survivor. The ranch hands, too, were forced to acknowledge her. At first, their whispers were sharp and cruel, easily overheard through the thin walls of the bunkhouse. Supposed to get the pretty one, got the other instead. She won't last. But as the days turned into weeks, the laughter died down. When they saw her struggling with a heavy feed sack and refusing to ask for help, their derision turned into a grudging respect. Elara caught him watching her once while she was attempting to fix a small tear in the fence line. She was clumsy, struggling with the wire, but she didn't stop until the repair was secure. When she looked up, his gaze was intense, troubled. He quickly looked away, his expression slamming shut, but the damage was done. In that fleeting moment, the man who had only seen a mistake saw something solid. This daily repetition of proving herself was fundamentally shifting her identity. She no longer saw herself as the failure her father had labeled her. She saw herself as the woman who had carried the most water, who had mucked the most muck. Her worth was no longer measured by the silk of her dress or the approval of her father, but by the raw, tangible capability of her own two hands. And that quiet, internal shift was the real beginning of her victory. She was still under his roof, still eating at his silent table, but she was no longer merely tolerated. She was a fixture of the relentless landscape, earned through the currency of her own sweat and scars. And that realization that she was building her own value gave her the strength to face the challenges she knew were still looming on the horizon. The question remained, though. Had Magnus noticed enough to change the verdict that still hung over her head? The deep emotional shifts in any great story rarely happen with grand declarations. They occur in the unspoken language of shared trials, in moments where character is revealed through action, not words. For Elara and Magnus, this moment arrived not in a gentle moment of shared humanity, but in the fierce, untamed presence of a wild beast. The ranch kept a young stallion, a powerful black creature that was more spirit than muscle. No one could handle him. Magnus himself, a man whose strength was legendary, had tried the standard methods: force, the sharp bite of the rope, sheer human will. But the animal fought back with a terrifying fury, hooves striking, teeth bared, rejecting all attempts at dominance. The ranch hands called him Satan's steed and gave him a wide berth. One morning before the dawn had fully broken, Magnus found Elara in the corral. The sight stopped him cold. She was not using a rope. She was not using a whip. She stood perfectly still, her palm outstretched, her stance one of quiet, absolute patience. The stallion, usually a tempest of panic and aggression, was stamping and snorting before her, wild-eyed and ready to bolt, yet curiously contained. The ranch hands, already emerging for their day's labor, paused. They snickered, anticipating the disaster. She'll be trampled. She's mad. Magnus, however, did not move. He stood, arms crossed, his jaw tight, watching this impossible confrontation unfold. He saw the soft curve of her body against the powerful musculature of the horse, and for a terrifying moment, he expected to see blood. But Elara's voice was a low, steady murmur, barely a whisper carried on the cold morning air. "Easy now," she soothed. "No one's going to hurt you." It was a promise, not a command. She was speaking to the animal not from a position of authority, but of empathy. She was offering understanding to something wild and rejected. Minutes passed, stretching out into an eternity of silence, broken only by the stallion's anxious breathing. The ranch hands grew silent. The animal's ears flicked forward, listening not to the words, but to the unshakable calm beneath them. Its muscles trembled, and then slowly, agonizingly, it did the unthinkable. The stallion lowered its head. It nudged its velvet nose into her open palm. Magnus felt a visceral shock run through him. His brute force had failed. His years of ranching experience had failed. But her quiet patience, the very quality he had mistaken for weakness, had succeeded. It was a profound, humbling revelation. The strength he valued, the hard, sharp, demanding power of the land, was being mastered by the soft, enduring power of the woman he had dismissed. Elara stroked the horse's nose, her touch feather-light, completely without fear. There was no fight, no panic, just a deep, mutual trust. And in that moment, she tamed not just the stallion, but a piece of Magnus's heart. He saw the deep wisdom in her, the understanding that true control comes from connection, not coercion. That night, Magnus lingered by the corral long after the others had left. He watched Elara brush down the horse, murmuring softly as the animal leaned into her calm. He realized that Elara was not just enduring the land. She was becoming an essential part of it. He had always believed the land belonged to him, the man of strength. Now, he thought, maybe she doesn't belong to the land. Maybe the land belongs to her. The shift between them began in silence. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it was acknowledgement. He began to show her things without words, which fields to check at dusk for new calves, how to spot the subtle signs of weakness in a fence, the patterns of the wind and the coming storms. It was an apprenticeship granted not to a wife, but to a fellow worker whose judgment he trusted. The silence that once felt heavy and cold between them began to feel pregnant, heavy with something unnamed, something that felt fragile and powerful all at once. One evening, Elara found him on the porch, staring at the horizon. She almost retreated, but then he spoke, his voice low and steady. Not a command, but a shared observation. "Storm's coming. You'll want to bring the chickens in." It was the first time he had spoken words to her that weren't a reflection of his anger or a demanding chore. It was the language of partnership. Her lips curved faintly, a small, genuine smile that startled him. "Yes, Magnus," she replied. The exchange was simple, yet it sealed a truce. The wall between them was not gone, but it had cracked, and through that fissure, a fragile new language had begun to grow. The emotional truce that had settled between Elara and Magnus was a fragile thing, built on calloused hands and unspoken respect. They had found a rhythm in the demanding life of the ranch, a partnership forged in silent labor, not in love. But every person who has ever found quiet contentment knows that it is often the calm before a devastating storm. And for Elara, that storm arrived not as a crack of thunder, but as the polished gleam of a carriage arriving unannounced. One blisteringly hot afternoon, the dust on the horizon thickened, but it wasn't the cattle. Soon a large, elaborate carriage, a shocking display of city wealth against the stark poverty of the plains, rolled to a stop near the main house. And out stepped Lila. Lila, Elara's younger sister, was the living embodiment of everything the ranch was not. She was dressed in shimmering silk, untouched by dust or sun, her golden hair perfectly coiled. She looked less like a traveler and more like an ornament, preserved and pristine. The contrast with Elara, whose face was perpetually sun-kissed and whose work dress was patched and frayed, was a punch to the gut. Lila hadn't come alone. She was flanked by their father's shrewd-looking attorney, a man whose expensive suit seemed to wrinkle the clean air of the ranch. Elara froze. The terror was immediate, visceral. Lila was the shadow, the right woman, the beautiful promise she had been exchanged for. Lila's presence invalidated everything Elara had quietly earned. The attorney cleared his throat, holding a thick folded document. He hadn't bothered to hide his distaste for the rough surroundings. "Mr. Holt," he began, his voice condescendingly smooth, "we have determined that a clear breach of contract occurred. The agreed-upon goods, the daughter Lila, were not delivered. This was the final calculated move of her father's plan. They hadn't just intended to humiliate Magnus. They intended to use the legal breach to seize control of the ranch or at least extort a hefty financial penalty. This was never just about a bride. It was about legacy and greed." Lila stepped forward then, her smile bright and utterly hollow, reaching out a hand to Magnus with an intimacy she hadn't earned. "Cousin Magnus, darling," she purred, "it's all been such an embarrassing misunderstanding. Father only meant for me to travel when the weather was cooler, but I'm here now, ready to settle this, and everything else." Her eyes flickered to Elara, sweeping over her worn clothing and calloused hands with a dismissive cruelty that cut deeper than any whip. Magnus, who had been watching the scene unfold with slow-mounting fury, clenched his fists. The arrival of his old promise, the perfect, easy choice, forced him back into the initial dilemma. The woman he was promised versus the woman he had silently come to respect. The attorney laid out the ultimatum, his voice formal and cold. He demanded that Magnus nullify the contract, send Elara away, the joke daughter, and either accept Lila now or face a crippling lawsuit that would tie up his land and his legacy for years. "The choice, Mr. Holt, is quite clear," the attorney said, tapping the contract. "The beauty, the lineage, the correct daughter, or financial ruin. Your word is law, you see. You agreed to a specific trade." Elara's heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. All the months of enduring, of working, of earning Magnus's respect felt suddenly meaningless. They could be undone in a single cold business decision. She wasn't just afraid of being discarded. She was afraid of being sent back, a failure finally broken, or worse, knowing that her presence had destroyed the only man who had seen a glimmer of her worth. She finally met Magnus's gaze. His eyes were turbulent, filled with a terrible conflict. He was caught between his sworn honor, the massive financial threat, and the quiet, stubborn woman who stood beside him, shoulders rigid with defiance. She didn't beg. She just watched, waiting for the inevitable verdict. "Is my endurance worth the cost of your land?" her eyes silently asked. She knew her family was playing a savage, high-stakes game. And the prize wasn't just Magnus. The prize was the ranch itself. And with it, the power to erase her hard-won identity forever. The moment of truth, the climax she had been dreading since she climbed into that wagon, had finally arrived. This was the moment of reckoning. The ranch house, which had become a place of silent truce, was now a battleground for contracts, pride, and legacy. Lila stood radiant, the embodiment of the easy path, the safe choice. The attorney stood smugly, holding the thread of ruin, and Elara stood worn and scarred, her worth hanging on the single decision of the man who had only ever seen her as a burden. Lila didn't wait for Magnus to speak. She pressed her advantage, her voice dripping like poison and honey combined. "You know what they say, Cade," she cooed, deliberately using a familiar name to try and push Elara into the role of outsider. "You never truly wanted her. Look at her. She looks like one of your ranch hands. Dusty, clumsy, and too much trouble. You wanted me. You want the beauty, the lineage, the ease. You still do. Don't throw away everything you've built for a misguided sense of obligation to a joke." The attorney chimed in, his voice cutting through the tension. "The choice is practical, Mr. Holt. Send her back. Accept the intended bride. Protect your holdings." He pointed a precise finger at Elara. "She is a liability, a poor advertisement for the prestige of the Holt name." Elara's heart hammered, but she refused to shrink. She would not beg. She had spent too long earning her strength to surrender it now. She stepped forward, the sound of her heavy work boots solid on the wood floor, a direct contrast to Lila's delicate heels. Her eyes, usually lowered in humility, met Magnus's gaze with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "If this is what you want, Magnus," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm, "then say it. Say it now and I'll go. I won't live where I am not chosen. I won't be merely tolerated again." Her words stunned the room into a brief, fragile silence. Lila's perfect smile faltered, her pretense momentarily shattered. Elara's statement was not a plea for love. It was a demand for truth and dignity. It forced Magnus to confront not his contract, but his conscience. Magnus's eyes never left Elara's. In that single drawn-out moment, the entire history of the past months flashed between them. Not Lila's beauty, which was like cold glass, but Elara's strength. He remembered the sight of her small figure battling the wind to close the barn doors in the storm. He recalled the silent dedication as she lifted buckets too heavy for her frame, refusing to quit. He saw the gentle persistence that had tamed the wild stallion he could only subdue with force. He had asked for a trophy, and his father-in-law had sent him a warrior. He took a slow, deep breath, and when he spoke, the sheer power of his voice shook the house, silencing the attorney and shattering Lila's composure. "No, Lila," he stated, his voice final, utterly certain. He didn't move toward the beautiful sister. He took a purposeful, earth-shaking step toward Elara. His eyes were locked on hers, filled with a raw, undeniable truth she had never dared to hope for. "I never asked for her, but she is the one I want. She is the one I choose." Lila's face twisted into an ugly mask of disbelief and fury. Her charm, her weapon had failed. The attorney sputtered, waving the contract, but Magnus cut him off with a single sharp look that silenced him completely. Elara's chest tightened, tears pricked her eyes. Not tears of pain, but of profound, disbelieving relief. He had chosen her. The man who had judged her, the man who had rejected her, had ultimately seen her. Magnus closed the final space between them. His large hand, scarred and rough from the land, lifted to her cheek. He gently brushed away a tear that had escaped. "You are not a mistake," he whispered, his voice deep and reverent. "You are not a joke. You are the only person who has stood on this land and never broken. You are mine, if you'll have me." And then came the ultimate blow to her father's cruel legacy. Turning to the attorney, Magnus's face hardened with the cold, calculating mind of the rancher. "Since the original contract was breached by failure to deliver the intended goods," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "I hereby declare that contract null and void. However, I have married Elara, and she is my wife." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "And let me make this perfectly clear. My wife is not merely my partner. She has proven she possesses the strength, the resilience, and the heart required and my sole heir to all Holt properties. The attorney paled. Lila let out a shriek of outrage, her mask completely gone. They had meant to punish Magnus and seize his wealth. Instead, they had forced him to recognize the worth of the daughter they discarded, and in doing so, they had handed her control of the entire fortune. Lila stormed toward the door, her fury a blazing ruin. "You'll regret this, Magnus," she spat. "You're throwing away beauty for scraps." Magnus didn't turn. He kept his eyes on Elara, steady and sure, and together they listened as the door slammed shut, the sound echoing the final definite end of her old life. The storm outside had passed. The real storm, the battle for her soul, had finally been won. The slamming of the door behind Lila was not merely the sound of a closing exit. It was the definitive sound of a past life being violently sealed shut. The house was quiet again, but the silence was fundamentally transformed. It was no longer the heavy, accusing silence of rejection, but a quiet filled with the immense, fragile weight of newly acknowledged love and power. Magnus stood before Elara, his hand still on her cheek, his gaze no longer searching or troubled, but settled and true. The years of quiet shame that Elara had carried, the feeling of being the unwanted mistake, began to lift. She saw herself reflected in his eyes not as a burden, but as the strong, steady foundation upon which he wanted to build his future. His choice, delivered with such conviction in the face of ruin, wasn't just about love. It was a profound act of validation that overturned every cruel word her father had ever spoken. She finally allowed the tears to fall, not in hiding, but openly, letting herself be fully seen for the very first time. And when Magnus's lips finally brushed hers, it wasn't out of pity or duty, but with a deep, certain reverence for the spirit he had found beneath the surface. The days that followed were built on this new foundation. The ranch didn't suddenly become easy. The sun still beat down, the work remained back-breaking, and the dust still flew. But the context had changed everything. The cabin no longer felt bare. It was a home, warmed by shared laughter and mutual respect. Meals were no longer endured in silence across a chasm of contempt, but shared as partners discussing the day's victories and challenges. Elara worked the land, and Magnus worked beside her, but now they moved as one unit, her quiet persistence balanced by his formidable strength. Elara's status shift wasn't a secret whispered in the bunkhouse. It was a declaration made to the world. When neighbors came by, or when they rode into the nearest town, the narrative had flipped. The wealthy rancher, Magnus Holt, had not just reluctantly accepted the joke daughter. He had chosen her. He had elevated her, making her the co-owner of his entire legacy. This was a truth that baffled the society that valued surface beauty and ease, but it was one they couldn't deny. Elara was no longer merely Magnus's wife. She was the heiress of Holt Ranch, her authority derived not from birthright, but from earned resilience. The change in Elara was striking. Her body, hardened by months of labor, had found a powerful equilibrium. More importantly, her eyes held a calm authority. She wore her work-stained clothes not as a symbol of shame, but as a badge of honor. She wasn't just managing the house. She was out in the corrals, her voice steady and confident, often calming the animals and the ranch hands alike. She was the one who rode the once wild Stallion, a constant living symbol of her ability to tame the untamable. As for her family, the consequences of their malice were swift and total. Their legal maneuvers failed against Magnus's iron will and the legally binding nature of his final decision. They received nothing. The ultimate punishment her father had devised, the humiliation of Magnus and the abandonment of Elara, had instead gifted Elara power and stripped them of the only legacy they truly cared about, the ranch's wealth. Their greed had delivered their own undoing. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the vast plains in hues of orange and gold, colors that finally matched the warmth in their home, Magnus wrapped his arm around Elara's waist. He pressed his forehead to hers, the dust of the day a familiar comfort between them. "What began as a cruel trick," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, "turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." They thought they were punishing us, but they gave me the only woman worthy of this land. Elara smiled, a genuine, strong smile, free of any past bitterness. She looked out over the endless stretch of their land, the land she had earned with her own sweat and silent defiance. She was no longer the daughter sent away in shame. She was no longer the shadow of her sister. She was Elara Holt, chosen, powerful, and the sole heir. She had transformed her father's joke into her permanent throne. If you resonated with Elara's quiet fire, if you believe that true strength is measured in resilience, not waistlines, then you understand the core of every story we tell here on True Western Stories. We don't just share tales of the Old West. We unearth the true emotional battles of those who refuse to be broken, the hidden triumphs, the unexpected heroes, and the fierce love forged in the unforgiving dust.